If you ever get the chance to listen to those declassified tapes from the Barents Sea Trench, you won't hear shifting rock or migrating whales. You'll hear heavy, metallic knocking. 3 fast strikes. A pause. 3 slow. Then 2 heavy strikes. It has been decades since our boat broke surface, but I still check my ceiling every single night before I sleep. Because whatever we dragged up from that black water didn't just let us go. It memorized our voices. And I am finally going to tell you exactly what happened down there. If you ask any submariner what the most terrifying sound in the world is, they won't tell you it's an explosion. They won't say it's a torpedo propeller spinning up in the dark, or that sudden deafening ping of enemy active sonar slamming against your hull. Those things are bad, sure. They mean you have been found, and they usually mean you are about to die. But they are known quantities. They are acts of war, and war is something we are trained to understand. No, the most terrifying sound you can hear when you are suspended in the lightless, freezing abyss of the deep ocean is a sound that simply shouldn't be there. A sound that breaks the laws of physics, the laws of the sea, and the boundaries of your own sanity. I have spent 20 years of my life inside steel tubes, breathing recycled air that tastes like diesel and ozone. I was a chief engineer during the absolute peak of the Cold War. My entire world consisted of pressure gradients, tensile strength, reactor temperatures, and the unyielding laws of thermodynamics. I trusted steel. I trusted gauges. I trusted the men I served with. I did not believe in ghost stories. I did not believe in the supernatural. When you are operating hundreds of feet below the surface, surrounded by water pressure that could crush a city block into the size of a soup can, you don't have the luxury of an active imagination. You rely on what you can measure. But there is one deployment I have never spoken about. Not in the chief's mess, not at the Veterans Hall, and certainly not to my family. The official records say we struck an uncharted seamount under the Arctic ice pack. The records say we suffered severe structural damage due to a navigational error, limped back to port, and the crew was reassigned. That is the lie I was ordered to sign my name to. What I am about to tell you is the truth of what actually happened down there in the dark. It was the late 1970s. The silent war beneath the waves was in full swing. We were playing a deadly, invisible game of cat and mouse with the Soviet Navy, trailing their boomers, tapping their cables, and gathering acoustic intelligence. We were aboard a highly modified fast-attack submarine. I won't give you her name or her hull number, but she was a hunter-killer, retrofitted with experimental acoustic tiles on her outer hull to absorb sonar pings and run quieter than anything else in the water. Our captain was a man named Elias. He was a seasoned, by-the-book commander. The kind of man who treated the Cold War like a grandmaster treats a chessboard. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He didn't gamble with his boat, and he demanded absolute perfection from his crew. I respected him immensely. He was exactly the kind of man you want holding the keys to a nuclear reactor and a dozen wire-guided torpedoes. But this mission felt wrong from the moment we slipped our moorings at Holy Loch in Scotland. Usually, before a patrol, the senior officers are briefed on our patrol box. We know if we are hunting a specific Soviet submarine class, or if we are shadowing a surface fleet. This time, Elias was given sealed orders, and we took on a passenger. His name was Julian. He was a naval intelligence officer, though he didn't wear a uniform. He showed up on the pier wearing a civilian trench coat, carrying a heavy, locked titanium briefcase handcuffed to his wrist. Julian was a spook. He had that detached, dead-eyed look that all those intelligence guys seem to share, like he was constantly doing math in his head, and you were just a variable he hadn't figured out what to do with yet. Julian didn't care about our standard operations. During our transit north, into the Norwegian Sea and eventually the Barents Sea, we picked up the distant acoustic signatures of 2 Soviet hunter-killers. Standard procedure would be to alter course, shadow them, or quietly slip into the baffles behind them to gather acoustic data. Julian explicitly ordered Elias to ignore them. He spent hours in the wardroom, hunched over classified bathymetric maps that he refused to let our own navigator see. He would just give Elias a heading and a depth, and retreat to his stateroom. He was not hunting Soviets. He was looking for a very specific piece of real estate at the bottom of the ocean. By the second week, we had crossed well past the Arctic Circle. We were operating beneath a semi-permanent ice shelf. If you have never been under the ice, it is difficult to explain the specific kind of claustrophobia it induces. In the open ocean, no matter how deep you are, you always know that if things go catastrophically wrong, you can blow the emergency ballast tanks and shoot to the surface. You have a roof of air above you. But under the Arctic ice pack, your roof is 30 to 50 feet of jagged solid ice. It is an inverted mountain range above your head. If there is a fire, if there is a flood, if the reactor scrams, you cannot surface. You are trapped in a lightless corridor between the crushing pressure of the deep sea and an impenetrable ceiling of ice. Julian's coordinates led us to an uncharted oceanic trench. The seafloor simply dropped away beneath us, plunging into a black abyss that was not on any of our standard navigational charts. Elias ordered us to descend into the trench, taking us dangerously close to our test depth. The pressure at that depth is something you can physically feel inside the boat. As chief engineer, it was my job to monitor the structural integrity of the pressure hull. When a submarine goes that deep, the ocean literally squeezes the vessel. The steel hull compresses. We used to tie a piece of string taut across the main passageway before we submerged. By the time we reached the bottom of that trench, the string was sagging by several inches. The entire submarine had physically shrunk. The bulkheads groaned and popped constantly, a sound like distant rifle fire echoing through the corridors. Elias ordered us to rig for ultra-quiet. When you rig for ultra-quiet, the submarine basically goes into a coma. The main reactor coolant pumps are shifted to low speed. The ventilation fans are dialed back to a bare whisper, making the air thick, hot, and stale. The crew must wear soft-soled shoes. You are not allowed to speak above a whisper. You cannot drop a wrench. You cannot slam a hatch. You cannot even let a heavy book fall onto a desk. In the absolute silence of the deep ocean, the sound of a dropped tool hitting a steel deck plate can carry for miles. It sounds like a dinner bell to any hostile torpedoes in the area. Because we could not use active sonar, which would light us up like a beacon, we were entirely blind. Our only eyes were the passive hydrophones arrayed along the hull, listening to the dark. The man in charge of those ears was a young petty officer named Vance. Vance was a kid, barely 22 years old, but he was an acoustic savant. He could sit in the dim, red-lit sonar shack, staring at the waterfall displays, and tell you if a ship 50 miles away was a fishing trawler or a destroyer, just by the rhythmic thrum of its propellers. He could identify the biological clicks of whales, the grind of shifting tectonic plates, or the high-pitched whine of an incoming weapon. His entire world was built on identifying and categorizing ocean sounds. But a few hours after we settled into our holding pattern inside the trench, Vance started complaining about the acoustics. I was in the control room, checking the hydraulic pressure gauges, when Vance called me over the sound-powered phone. I walked the few steps into the sonar shack. It was cramped, smelling of hot electronics and old coffee. Vance had one side of his headset pushed off his ear, looking frustrated. He told me the acoustics down there were driving him crazy. We were sitting in some kind of thermal gradient. The water temperature drops so sharply outside the hull that it creates a boundary layer. It acts like a mirror. I nodded slowly. I knew about acoustic mirroring. Sometimes, dense layers of cold water can reflect sound waves perfectly, bouncing them back instead of letting them pass through. He asked what he was hearing. He said us. Every time one of the boys in the engine room shifted a valve, the sound traveled out, hit the trench wall, and bounced back into his hydrophones. But there was a lag, and it was too clean, he said. It was like the ocean was recording us and playing it back a few seconds later. It was messing with his baseline. I told him I would have the engine room boys tighten up their movements, and I patted him on the shoulder. It was a strange phenomenon, but it was just physics. Water density and sound waves. Nothing to worry about. I went back to the engineering spaces, completely unaware of how deeply that acoustic mirror was about to factor into the nightmare that was waiting for us. It was the mid-watch, roughly 3 a.m., when the real trouble started. The sub was completely silent, suspended in the black water like a sleeping leviathan. Most of the crew was in their racks. I was in the wardroom nursing a cup of lukewarm bitter coffee, going over the reactor logs. Julian was sitting at the other end of the table, his titanium briefcase resting on his lap, staring blankly at the bulkhead. He had not slept in 2 days. The intercom on the wall clicked. It was Elias, his voice a tight, controlled whisper. "Chief Engineer. Report to the sonar shack." I set my mug down. You don't get called to sonar in the middle of the night unless something has gone wrong with the plant, or there's a threat in the water. I moved quickly and quietly through the narrow passageways, stepping over the high sills of the watertight doors until I reached the control room. Elias was already there, standing behind Vance's chair in the sonar shack. The space was bathed in the glow of the green monitors and the tactical red lighting. Vance looked pale. His hands were hovering over his keyboard, rigid. I asked what we had. Elias didn't look at me. He just gestured to Vance. "Play it for him." Vance reached out and flipped a toggle switch on his console, routing the audio from his headset to the small overhead speaker in the shack. At first, there was only the low, ambient hiss of the deep ocean, the sound of water moving under immense pressure. Then, cutting through the static, crisp and clear, came a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. A metallic clink. It sounded exactly like someone taking a heavy iron wrench and striking it against a thick steel pipe. Then again. Then a third time. I frowned, looking at Vance. Asked if it was an acoustic return. Asked if someone in the engine room dropped something. Vance shook his head, his eyes locked on his screen. Said it was external. Coming from outside the boat. From the dark. Told me to listen to the pattern. The sound repeated. 3 fast strikes. A pause. 3 slow strikes. A pause. 3 fast strikes. It was an SOS. I stared at the speaker, my mind struggling to process what I was hearing. I whispered it was impossible. We were at 1,200 feet. The water pressure out there was over 500 pounds per square inch. A diver would be crushed into paste the second they left an airlock. There is no one outside this submarine. Elias said it had to be a distressed vessel. His voice carried the calm, authoritative weight of a man trying to force logic onto an illogical situation. He suggested a Soviet submersible, or a deep-sea crawler. They must be sitting on the bottom of the trench, tapping on their hull to signal for help. He ordered Vance to give him a full passive sweep. Find their engine signature. Know exactly where they are. Vance's hands flew over his console. He was the best in the fleet, and I watched him isolate different frequency bands, filtering out the ambient noise, searching the black water for the telltale signs of a machine. When a submarine is in the water, even a dead one, it makes noise. If there are men alive inside it, There are life support systems running. There is the hum of a battery, the vibration of air scrubbers, the faint whine of an inverter. Even if they have lost all power, a massive metal tube sitting on the ocean floor disrupts the natural currents, creating an acoustic shadow. Vance swept the sector for 5 agonizing minutes. The only sound in the shack was the rhythmic, metallic knocking on the overhead speaker. Finally, Vance pulled his hands away from the console. He looked up at Captain Elias, and I saw genuine fear in the kid's eyes for the first time. He told us there was nothing. Elias told him to check his filters. If they are close enough for us to hear a wrench hitting a bulkhead, they are close enough for us to hear their plant. Vance pleaded, said he checked everything. He was sweeping the entire spectrum. Low frequency, high frequency, everything. There are no pumps running, no battery hum, no reactor noise, not even an acoustic shadow to indicate a hull displacing water. The sector was completely sterile. Elias asked what was making that sound. Vance said he didn't know. But according to the hydrophones, whatever is tapping that SOS, it doesn't have an engine. It doesn't have power. It doesn't have a hull. The 3 of us stood there in the dim red light, listening to the rhythmic metallic plea coming from the speaker. It was mathematically, physically impossible. We were at the bottom of the world, buried under a ceiling of ice, surrounded by water so cold and so pressurized it was hostile to all forms of life. We were entirely, completely alone. And yet, something was out there in the dark, asking for help. Suddenly, Vance gasped and ripped his headset off, throwing it onto the console as if it had burned him. He spun his chair around, his eyes wide with panic, staring at the portside bulkhead of the sonar shack. I asked what it was. He stammered that it stopped. The signal on the hydrophones just vanished. I looked at the overhead speaker. The hiss of the ocean was still there, but the metallic clinking had ceased. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the control room. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. Maybe it was a thermal anomaly. Maybe it was a strange piece of debris bouncing along the bottom. I started to formulate the engineering explanation in my head, ready to assure the captain that it was just an acoustic ghost. But before I could open my mouth, the silence was shattered. It didn't come from the overhead speaker. It didn't come through the electronic filters of the sonar system. It came through the steel. 3 heavy thuds. The sound reverberated violently through the actual portside bulkhead of the control room, so loud and so heavy that I felt the vibration travel through the soles of my shoes and up into my teeth. It wasn't a wrench tapping in the distance anymore. It was something massive, something incredibly heavy, striking the outer hull of our submarine. 3 fast strikes, 3 slow strikes. Elias and I locked eyes, the blood draining from our faces. Whatever had been out there in the dark, calling to us, it wasn't in the distance anymore. It had found us, and it was knocking on our door. For a span of perhaps 10 seconds, nobody in the control room breathed. The 3 heavy thuds had been so violent that a fine dusting of white paint flakes drifted down from the overhead pipes, catching the dim red tactical lighting as they fell. The vibration was still humming in the soles of my boots. We were suspended 1,200 feet below the surface of the Barents Sea, trapped beneath an impenetrable ceiling of Arctic ice, and something had just struck the outside of our pressure hull with the force of a wrecking ball. I looked at Captain Elias. I expected to see the same paralyzing shock that I knew was written across my own face. But Elias was a creature of rigid naval doctrine. His mind simply rejected the impossible. If something was touching his submarine, it was a physical object. If it was a physical object, it was a threat, and threats could be categorized, countered, and neutralized. He ordered Vance to report what it was. Vance was staring at his monitors, hands gripping the edges of his console so hard his knuckles were white. He told the captain he had no acoustic signature. No engine noise, no ballast pumps, no propeller cavitation. Whatever just hit us didn't swim here, and it didn't drive here. It just appeared. Elias said nothing just appears. He stepped away from the sonar shack and moved to the center of the control room. He looked up at the overhead, his eyes tracking the steel plates, as if he could see through them into the black water. He insisted the Soviets have been pouring billions into deep-water espionage programs. They've been testing autonomous crawler drones, magnetic limpet systems, acoustic warfare devices. Whatever that was, it was a machine. They managed to drop a stealth drone onto our hull to harass us or paint us for a torpedo. It was a rational explanation. It was the only explanation that allowed us to keep functioning. If it was a Soviet drone, it was a piece of metal and wiring. It obeyed the laws of physics. He ordered the diving officer to make depth 1,300 feet, 5-degree down angle, a slow, controlled descent. Scrape the Soviet hardware off our back. He ordered me to oversee the trim. Keep the plant absolutely quiet. Do not break noise discipline. I moved to the ballast control panel. Changing depth while rigged for ultra-quiet is a painstakingly slow process. We couldn't just blow the tanks or fire up the main hydraulic pumps. The noise would deafen our own sonar and announce our position. Instead, we had to rely on the auxiliary trim manifold, slowly bleeding water from the forward trim tanks to the aft trim tanks, using gravity and the minimal thrust of our electric creep motor to angle the bow downward. The deck slowly tilted beneath our feet. The inclinometer on the bulkhead ticked past 2 degrees, then 3, then 5. The submarine groaned in protest. At 1,300 feet, the water pressure is over 600 pounds per square inch. Every square inch of our hull was bearing the weight of a heavy motorcycle. The steel compressed further. The bulkheads popped and cracked like rifle fire. We held that agonizing descent for 10 minutes. The only sounds were the creaking of the hull and the ragged breathing of the men in the control room. We waited for the sound of metal scraping against metal, the sound of a drone being dislodged and tumbling away into the trench. Instead, the knocking returned. But it wasn't a localized thud anymore. It was lighter this time, sharper, like the head of a steel hammer tapping against the outer hull. And it was moving. It started near the forward torpedo room, echoing down the length of the boat. Then it moved aft, passing above the officer's wardroom. Then it was directly over the control room. I looked up at the ceiling, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. The sound wasn't the random bumping of a tethered drone dragging against the hull. It had a cadence, a rhythm. It sounded exactly like the heavy, deliberate footsteps of a man walking across a steel deck in heavy boots. But the footsteps were on the outside of the submarine. The sound continued its slow, methodical march aft, moving past the control room, heading toward the reactor compartment and the engine room. I told Elias that whatever it wasn't stationary. It was tracking along the port side, moving toward the engineering spaces. Elias's jaw was clenched so tight, I thought his teeth might shatter. He ordered me to go aft, get into the engine room, visual inspection of the inner pressure hull, check the welds, check the hydraulic lines. If that thing is a magnetic crawler, know if it's stressing the steel. I grabbed a heavy rubber-coated flashlight from the bulkhead rack and stepped through the aft watertight door. Walking through a submarine rigged for ultra-quiet is like walking through a tomb. The normal, comforting hum of the ventilation fans was reduced to a breathless whisper. The air was already growing thick and hot, heavy with the smell of amine, diesel oil, and the nervous sweat of 120 men. The tactical red lighting cast long, distorted shadows down the narrow passageways. As I moved through the crew's mess and the berthing areas, I saw the faces of the sailors. These were tough, highly trained kids who volunteered for the most dangerous duty in the Navy. But right now, they were terrified. They were sitting up in their racks or huddled in the passageways, their eyes wide, staring up at the curved steel ceiling. They had all heard the footsteps. They were looking to me for reassurance, for the chief to tell them it was just a thermal popping or a loose piece of fairing. I didn't say a word. I just kept walking, placing my soft-soled shoes carefully on the deck plates to avoid making a sound. I passed through the heavily shielded tunnel that ran alongside the nuclear reactor, the air growing noticeably hotter, until I reached the heavy watertight door of the main engine room. I dogged the hatch open and stepped inside. The engine room is my domain. It is a massive, two-story cavern of reduction gears, steam turbines, and miles of insulated piping. Normally, it is deafeningly loud and sweltering hot, temperatures easily reaching over 100 degrees. Right now, with the plant dialed back to a crawl, it was eerily quiet. The massive turbines were barely turning, emitting a low, rhythmic thrum. My engineering watchstanders were clustered near the portside bulkhead, looking up at the curved steel of the hull. Miller, my lead mechanic, whispered as I approached. He looked pale, told me it stopped right above us. But I needed to look at something. He pointed his flashlight at the bulkhead. I stepped closer, aiming my own beam at the spot he was illuminating. The inner pressure hull of a submarine is covered in thick, fire-resistant acoustic insulation. Over that insulation, there are painted steel panels. Right in the center of the portside bulkhead, the gray paint was changing color. It was turning white. I reached out and pulled off my leather work glove. I pressed my bare palm against the steel panel. The cold was instantaneous and agonizing. It felt like grabbing a block of dry ice. The heat was being sucked out of the engine room, through the steel, and into the ocean at an impossible rate. As I watched, the moisture in the humid, stagnant air of the engine room began to condense against the freezing metal. The condensation crystallized. Frost was forming on the bulkhead, spreading outward in a spiderweb pattern of white ice. I am an engineer. I know the laws of thermodynamics. For frost to form on the inside of an insulated bulkhead in a 100-degree engine room, the temperature on the outside of the hull couldn't just be the ambient 30-degree temperature of the Arctic Ocean. It had to be dropping to a localized, absolute zero. Something was acting as a massive, unnatural heat sink, drawing the thermal energy out of our submarine. Suddenly, the vibration started again, right under my hand. 3 fast, 3 slow. The force of the tap vibrated through the freezing steel, traveling up my arm and rattling my teeth. I snatched my hand back, my palm stinging from the cold. I pulled the sound-powered phone from its cradle on the bulkhead, cranking the handle to ring the control room. I whispered into the mouthpiece. Told the captain the hull integrity is holding, but we have a severe thermal anomaly on the port side, frame 64. The bulkhead is freezing over. Whatever is out there, it's dropping the temperature of the steel to sub-zero levels. Frost is forming inside the engine room. There was a pause on the line. Then, I heard Vance's voice in the background, frantic and high-pitched. Elias's voice came back, sounding strained, told me to get back to the control room. Now. I hung up the phone, gave Miller a strict order not to touch the bulkhead, and made the long walk forward. When I stepped back through the watertight door into the control room, the atmosphere had shifted from tense to chaotic. Vance was standing up from his sonar console, holding a pair of headphones out toward Captain Elias. Julian, the intelligence officer, had finally moved from the wardroom. He was standing in the center of the space, his titanium briefcase still handcuffed to his wrist, his face a mask of cold fury. He ordered Vance to classify those tapes immediately. Wipe the waterfall displays. Not speak of this to anyone in the crew. Direct order under naval intelligence. Elias stepped between the spook and the young sonar man. Said Vance doesn't work for naval intelligence. He works for me. He made Vance tell me what he just told him. Vance looked terrified, his eyes darting between Elias and Julian. He swallowed hard. Said he ran the acoustic returns through the analyzer. The rhythm of the knocking. It's not just a generic SOS. I looked at him, confused. Asked what he meant. 3 fast, 3 slow, 3 fast. That's Morse code. Vance said it starts with Morse code, but it doesn't repeat immediately. There's a 5-second pause, followed by 2 sharp, heavy strikes. Then a 3-second pause, and it repeats the SOS. He didn't recognize it at first, because it's obsolete. It's from the diesel boat era. A cold dread began to pool in my stomach. I had been in the Navy a long time. I knew the old manuals. I said it's the emergency tap code. Vance nodded desperately. Said it's the classified U.S. Navy Submariner tap code. The specific sequence it's tapping. SOS, pause, double strike. It translates to compartment flooded. Bulkheads holding. No survivors. The control room fell dead silent again. Elias said a Soviet drone doesn't know our classified tap codes. A Soviet drone doesn't tap out messages in English, asking for rescue from a flooded compartment. He asked Julian what that is. Said Julian knew it was down here. That's why he guided us into this godforsaken trench. Julian didn't flinch. His dead eyes locked onto Elias. Told the captain he was dangerously close to violating the Espionage Act. We don't have clearance to understand parameters. Operating in highly contested sector. Soviets utilizing advanced psychological warfare tactics, including acoustic mirroring and acoustic deception. Whatever is out there is a machine designed to mimic our own distress signals, to force us to surface or break noise discipline. We will ignore it. Maintain depth. Surrender tapes. Elias stepped into his personal space. Said he is master of the vessel. Something is physically attached to his hull. Freezing his bulkheads. Walking on his deck. Tapping out distress code of a dead American crew. He wasn't going to sit there and let him. He never finished. The interruption didn't come from a voice. It came from the ocean itself. A sound echoed through the submarine that I will never ever forget. It was a deep, agonizing groan of overstressed steel. It sounded like the moan of a dying whale, but it was metallic, reverberating through every deck plate and stanchion in the boat. It came from the aft section. From the engine room. The submarine violently shuddered. It wasn't a tap or a knock. It felt as though an impossibly massive hand had just closed around the stern of the boat. The deck beneath my feet suddenly heaved. I stumbled forward, throwing my arms out to catch myself against the navigation table. The plainsman at the yoke cried out in alarm, wrestling with the controls. The diving officer shouted, voice cracking with panic. Said we are losing trim. Massive uncommanded weight shift on the aft port quarter, taking a down angle. I stared at the inclinometer on the bulkhead. The needle was swinging wildly. 5 degrees down, 10 degrees down, 15 degrees. The submarine was tilting violently forward. Loose gear, coffee mugs, clipboards, and manuals went clattering across the deck, sliding toward the forward bulkhead. The men in the control room were grabbing onto railings and consoles just to stay on their feet. Elias roared to pump water forward. Full rise on the Fairwater plains. Catch the trim. The diving officer yelled he was trying, sweat pouring down his face as he fought the hydraulic yoke. Said the trim manifold was wide open, but it wasn't enough. We were heavy aft. It felt like something was pulling us down. The groaning of the hull grew louder, a terrifying high-pitched screech of metal reaching its yield point. Elias yelled over the din, looking at me with wild eyes, asking what the hell was happening in the engine room. I didn't have to answer. The sound-powered phone on the bulkhead began to ring, a shrill, frantic buzzing that cut through the chaos. I grabbed the handset, bracing my boots against the tilted deck to keep from sliding. Miller was screaming, said the portside bulkhead was caving in. Something was pushing through the steel. The words hit me like a physical blow. The portside bulkhead was caving in. My mind instantly rebelled against the concept. The pressure hull of a fast-attack submarine is forged from high-yield steel. It is designed to withstand the concussive shockwave of a nearby depth charge and the crushing, unimaginable weight of the deep ocean. It does not simply cave in. For the steel to yield without an explosive detonation, whatever was pressing against it had to possess a physical mass and a localized density that defied every conventional law of marine engineering. It was like a giant, invisible thumb pressing slowly into the side of an aluminum can. I roared into the sound-powered phone, ordered Miller to get everyone back, not try to brace it. If the steel shears, the water pressure will cut you in half before you even drown. Evacuate immediate space. Seal the watertight doors to the lower level. Miller's voice cracked with raw terror over the line. Said it's freezing. The whole bulkhead covered in ice. Bolts on hydraulic manifolds popping. I slammed the handset back into its cradle and turned to the chaos of the control room. We were in a rapid, uncommanded dive. The inclinometer was pegged at a 15-degree down angle, and the depth gauge was spinning. We were passing 1,350 feet, 1,400 feet. We were hurtling toward our crush depth, pulled down by an immense localized weight on the aft port quarter. Elias bellowed to blow the aft group. Bleed high-pressure air into the aft ballast tanks. Give full rise on the stern planes. Break this dive. The diving officer's hands were a blur as he slammed the heavy brass pneumatic toggles. Bluing aft group. Full rise on planes. A deafening roar filled the submarine as compressed air at 4,000 pounds per square inch was forced into the aft ballast tanks, violently displacing the seawater. It was a desperate, incredibly dangerous maneuver. If we blew too much water, the submarine would become dangerously buoyant. We would rocket upward, out of control, and slam directly into the jagged, 30-foot-thick ceiling of the Arctic ice canopy at 20 knots. We would crush our sail, destroy our periscopes, and likely rupture the upper pressure hull. We were trapped in a deadly vise, the crushing abyss below, and the impenetrable ice above. The submarine groaned, a deep, vibrating shudder that rattled my teeth. For 5 agonizing seconds, the depth gauge continued to spin downward. 1,420 feet. 1,430. The hull was screaming, the bulkheads popping with the sound of cannon fire as the steel compressed beyond its safe tolerances. Then, slowly, the needle slowed. It hesitated at 1,440 feet and began to tick backward. The diving officer yelled trim is catching, up angle returning, passing 10 degrees down, 5 degrees down, leveling out. Elias ordered secure the air. Catch her right here. Do not let us broach into the ice. The roar of the compressed air ceased. The deck leveled out beneath our boots, leaving us suspended in the black water, hovering dangerously close to the absolute structural limit of the submarine. The immediate crisis had passed, but the silence that followed was heavier and more terrifying than the noise of the alarms. We were alive, but we were crippled, blind, and carrying a dead weight that we could not understand. Elias slowly turned away from the navigation table. He didn't look at the diving officer, and he didn't look at me. He walked deliberately across the control room, his boots heavy on the deck plates, until he was standing chest to chest with Julian. The naval intelligence officer had managed to stay on his feet during the dive, his hand still gripping the titanium briefcase chained to his wrist. His face was pale, his dead eyes finally showing a flicker of genuine human anxiety, but he kept his jaw set. Elias said a Soviet drone did not do that. A Soviet crawler does not have the mass to drag a nuclear submarine down by the tail, and it does not have the power to push a dent into high-yield steel just by resting against it. We are 1,400 feet under the ice, boat damaged, crew terrified. He ordered Julian to open that briefcase and tell exactly what he brought us down here to find, or he would have me lock him in a torpedo tube and flood it. I stood a few feet away, my hands clenched into fists. I had never heard Elias threaten an officer before, but I would have gladly helped him do it. Julian stared at Elias for a long, calculating moment. He looked around the control room, at the pale, exhausted faces of the plainsmen, at Vance trembling in the sonar shack, and finally at me. He realized the chain of command had effectively dissolved. The uniform didn't matter down here in the dark. Survival mattered. Julian let out a slow, measured breath and unlocked the clasp on his briefcase. He told us 3 years ago, the United States Navy lost a fast attack submarine in this exact operational grid. The USS Proteus. 109 men aboard. Elias frowned, eyes narrowing. Said the Proteus was lost with all hands in the North Atlantic. Official inquiry stated catastrophic failure of main seawater piping system, a flooding event they couldn't recover from. Julian said the official inquiry was a fabricated cover story. Proteus was not in the North Atlantic. She was right here, in this trench, conducting highly classified acoustic survey, shadowing a new class of Soviet boomer. Then, she simply ceased to exist. No distress call, no acoustic signature of an explosion, no sound of a hull collapsing, no debris field spotted by satellites. One moment she was broadcasting a routine encrypted burst transmission, and the next, absolute silence. I interjected. Submarines don't just vanish without making a sound. Even if they took a catastrophic flood, the bulkheads would implode as they sank. Our Sosus listening nets would have picked up the acoustic shockwave of the crush half a world away. It registers like a seismic event. Julian said he was aware of the physics, which is why naval intelligence spent the last 3 years trying to figure out what happened. We assumed the Soviets had developed a new, undetectable weapon. A silent kill. But 6 months ago, an automated deep-sea hydrophone array, secretly anchored near the edge of this trench, picked up an anomaly. Julian reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single manila folder. He didn't open it. He just held it against his chest. The hydrophone picked up a sound coming from the bottom of the trench. It was rhythmic, metallic. It was the emergency tap code. 3 fast, 3 slow, double strike. Compartment flooded. Bulkheads holding. No survivors. It was the exact code assigned to the engineering department of the USS Proteus. A profound, sickening chill washed over me. I whispered it was impossible. He said she went missing 3 years ago. Even if they survived a sinking, even if they sealed themselves in a watertight compartment, their oxygen would have run out in a week. Lithium hydroxide scrubbers would have failed. They would have suffocated in days. No one is alive down there tapping on a hull 3 years later. Julian said they know that. They know they are dead. But the tapping continued. Intermittently. For months. Always the same code. Always from the same coordinates. My agency determined that the Soviets must have found the wreck of the Proteus. We believed they were using an acoustic transmitter to broadcast the tap code, using it as bait to lure another American submarine into the trench to investigate, so they could ambush us or steal our technology. Elias stared at Julian with a mixture of disgust and horror. So he used our boat, used our crew, brought us down here as a tethered goat, just to see what would bite. Julian said they needed a boat quiet enough to slip into the trench undetected. They needed to visually confirm if the Soviets had established a deep water recovery operation around the Proteus. But there are no Soviet submarines in this sector. No recovery operation. No machinery. Elias asked what is out there. Before the intelligence officer could answer, a sharp gasp echoed from the sonar shack. I spun around. Vance was pressed back into his chair, hands clamped over his headphones, eyes wide and staring blankly at the green waterfall displays on his monitor. His entire body was rigid, trembling violently. I stepped quickly into the cramped shack, asked Vance what he was hearing. He didn't respond. He just stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. I reached out and grabbed his shoulder. He flinched as if I had burned him, and frantically flipped the toggle switch to route his audio to the overhead speaker in the control room. The heavy metallic footsteps had stopped. The rhythmic tapping of the SOS was gone. Instead, the control room was filled with a low rhythmic thrumming. It was a deep mechanical vibration that I felt in my chest before I fully processed it with my ears. It was the sound of a steam plant. The steady, powerful churn of reduction gears, the high-pitched whine of turbine generators, and the heavy churning cavitation of a massive brass propeller biting into the water. Elias asked if that was a Soviet hunter-killer. Did they finally light off their plant? I said no, Captain. I stepped closer to the speaker, closing my eyes, letting my 20 years of engineering experience analyze the acoustic signature. Every class of submarine has a distinct heartbeat. The precise frequency of the gears, the blade rate of the propeller. It's an acoustic fingerprint that cannot be perfectly replicated by another vessel. I whispered that it's not a Soviet plant. It's an older American fast-attack boat. The Proteus. I'd stake my life on it. The diving officer asked how, since they've been dead for 3 years. Vance finally spoke, voice cracking, tears welling in his eyes. Told me to look at the display. The thermal boundary layer outside the hull. The acoustic mirror. I looked at his screen. The lines of data were chaotic, bouncing wildly. Vance sobbed that it's not coming from another submarine in the distance. The sound, the engine noise, it's coming from right outside our hull. Whatever is touching us, whatever is out there in the dark, it's projecting the sound of the Proteus. It's mimicking her engines. The sheer impossibility of it paralyzed my mind. A biological entity cannot generate the acoustic signature of a nuclear reactor. A machine cannot project sound without a power source. It was as if the ocean itself had recorded the death of the Proteus and was now playing it back to us, wrapping the ghost of that lost submarine around our own hull. But the horror was only just beginning. The low thrum of the phantom engines suddenly dipped in volume, fading into a background hiss. And then, a new sound came through the overhead speaker. It was a voice. It was a human voice, speaking English. But there was something fundamentally, deeply wrong with it. It lacked the natural cadence of human speech, the subtle intakes of breath, the emotional inflection. It sounded flat, metallic, and disjointed, as if someone had taken a magnetic tape of a man speaking, cut the tape into individual syllables with a razor blade, and spliced them back together in the wrong order. It said my captain's name. A collective shudder ran through the men in the control room. Elias froze, his face draining of all color. Asked, "How does it know his name?" The stitched-together voice continued, syllables dragging out unnaturally. "We are so cold, Elias." I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I recognized the pitch. I recognized the underlying timbre of the voice. I looked at Vance, and I knew he recognized it too. It was my voice. Whatever was out there, pressing against our hull, had listened to me speaking over the sound-powered phone when I was in the engine room. It had listened to Elias giving orders. It had absorbed the acoustic data of our voices, broke them down, and was now feeding them back to us through the acoustic mirror, using my stolen voice to call out to my captain. It asked to open the hatch. Flooded. No survivors. Panic, raw and infectious, finally broke the discipline of the crew. The plainsman backed away from the yoke. The quartermaster backed into a corner, muttering a prayer under his breath. We were highly trained technicians, men of science and steel, but we were being hunted by something that stripped away our logic and left us as nothing more than terrified prey, trapped in a metal can. Elias shouted to secure that speaker. "Vance, cut the audio. Now." Vance slammed his hand onto the console, killing the feed. The control room plunged back into the heavy, suffocating silence of the deep ocean. The only sound was our own ragged breathing and the distant, agonizing groan of the overstressed hull. I said that if that thing is still attached to the engine room bulkhead, it's acting as a massive thermal drain. If it continues to drop the temperature of the steel, it's going to affect the primary coolant loop of the reactor. The thermodynamics. I didn't get to finish the warning. A high-pitched warbling alarm suddenly shrieked through the submarine. It wasn't the collision alarm, and it wasn't the diving alarm. It was the engineering casualty alarm. I spun around and grabbed the sound-powered phone, not waiting for it to ring. Asked for engine room report. Miller's voice was frantic, barely audible over the wailing alarms. Said the temperature on the port side just plummeted again. The heat exchanger is freezing over, losing thermal efficiency in the primary loop. Reactor trying to compensate, but the heat is just vanishing into the hull. I looked at the repeater gauges mounted on the forward bulkhead of the control room. The telemetry from the nuclear plant was going haywire. The primary coolant temperature was dropping at an impossible rate. Physics dictates that a nuclear core generates immense heat. But whatever was gripping the aft section of our submarine was acting like a cosmic void, sucking the thermal energy out of the reactor faster than the uranium could produce it. I yelled that the automatic safety interlocks are going to trip. The plant is going to scram. Elias ordered me to override it. Do not lose the plant. If we lose propulsion, we are dead in the water. I shouted back that I can't override physics. The core is going supercooled. In the engine room, the automated safety systems, designed to prevent a catastrophic core failure, detected the impossible thermal drop. They did exactly what they were engineered to do. With a heavy, concussive thud that reverberated through the entire submarine, the magnetic latches on the control rod drive mechanisms released. The heavy control rods dropped directly into the nuclear core, instantly absorbing the neutrons and killing the fission chain reaction. The reactor scrammed. The low, comforting hum of the steam turbines died instantly. The ventilation fans spun down to a halt. The hydraulic pumps whined and fell silent. For 3 terrifying seconds, the submarine was plunged into absolute, pitch-black darkness. Then, with a series of loud clicks, the emergency battery breakers slammed shut. The dim, blood-red emergency lighting flickered to life along the bulkheads. We were completely dead in the water. We had no propulsion. We had no main power. We were a 14,000-ton iron coffin, suspended 1,400 feet below the ice, slowly losing our residual heat to the freezing abyss. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence in the red-lit control room was absolute, heavy, and final. Then, the sound returned. It wasn't the low thrum of the phantom engine. It wasn't the stitched-together voice. It was the footsteps. But they were no longer aft, near the engine room. The heavy metallic footsteps walked slowly across the non-skid decking on the very top of the submarine's outer hull. They were moving forward, tracking directly over the control room. We all looked up, staring at the curved steel ceiling, following the sound as it moved directly above our heads. The footsteps stopped. They had reached the base of the sail, the tall, fin-like structure that housed the periscopes and the main logistics hatch. We heard the distinct, heavy scrape of something massive dragging itself up the side of the sail. It moved upward, stopping at the very top, right above the primary access trunk, right above the hatch that separated us from the crushing pressure of the ocean. The silence hung for a second. Then, a heavy rhythmic knocking began on the thick steel of the upper hatch. 3 fast strikes, 3 slow strikes, and then, vibrating through the solid steel of the access trunk, clear enough that we didn't need the sonar to hear it, my own stolen voice echoed down into the control room. It asked to open the hatch. That stolen, stitched-together voice hung in the dead air of the control room, vibrating through the solid steel of the access trunk directly above our heads. It was my voice, but stripped of all humanity, flattened into a mechanical drone that sounded like a skipping phonograph record, playing at the bottom of a deep well. For a moment, the rigid discipline that held our crew together completely fractured. The young plainsman sitting at the stern planes control covered his ears and squeezed his eyes shut, his chest heaving with silent, hyperventilating panic. The quartermaster, a tough kid from the south side of Chicago, backed slowly into the navigation table, his hands gripping the edges so hard, the knuckles shone white in the blood-red emergency lighting. Even Julian, the untouchable intelligence spook, was frozen, his dead eyes fixed on the ceiling, the titanium briefcase suddenly looking like a very small, very useless shield. We were entombed in a dead submarine, 1,400 feet below the Arctic ice, and the ghost of a slaughtered crew was using my voice to politely ask us to let the ocean in. Elias was the first to break the paralysis. He didn't look up at the hatch. He didn't acknowledge the impossibility of what we had just heard. He simply refused to accept a reality where he was not in command of his vessel. He asked for our current buoyancy status, asked me to give the physics, right now. I forced my brain to engage, violently shoving the horror into a small, dark box in the back of my mind. I looked at the dark gauges, relying on my baseline knowledge of the boat's condition before we lost main power. I said, "We are heavy, Captain." When the reactor scrammed, we lost the main seawater circulation pumps. The thermal drain on the port side is causing massive, rapid condensation throughout the aft compartments. The air is freezing, the moisture is turning to water, and it's pooling in the bilges. It's adding physical weight to the boat. Without forward momentum to generate lift over the bow planes, we are a brick. We are slowly sinking. Elias looked at the mechanical depth gauge mounted on the bulkhead. It didn't require electricity to function. It operated purely on the external water pressure pressing against a diaphragm. The needle was ticking downward with agonizing slowness. 1,445 feet. 1,450 feet. Elias quietly stated crush depth for this hull design is classified at 1,550 feet. Said we have maybe 20 minutes before the pressure hull implodes. He ordered me to get back to the engine room. Take a damage control team, shore up that portside bulkhead. Don't care if you have to weld steel beams directly to the deck plates. Do not let that steel yield. I grabbed a heavy battle lantern from the emergency rack, its powerful halogen beam cutting a stark white cone through the dim red glow of the control room. I shouted for two of the auxiliary mechanics to follow me and sprinted aft, plunging back into the nightmare of the dark submarine. The temperature drop as we moved aft was staggering. Normally, the ambient heat of the nuclear reactor and the steam plant keeps the aft sections of the boat sweltering. Now, every breath we took plumed in the air as thick white vapor. The steel deck plates were slick with freezing condensation. We slipped and stumbled through the crew's mess, moving as fast as we dared in the pitch black, the beams of our battle lanterns bouncing crazily off the bulkheads. When we dogged open the heavy watertight door to the main engine room, the cold hit us like a physical wall. It was easily below zero inside the compartment. Miller and the rest of the engineering watchstanders were huddled near the starboard reduction gears, shining their own flashlights at the portside hull. I swept my battle lantern over the area, and my breath caught in my throat. The frost had spread. It was no longer just a localized patch. A massive, jagged glacier of white ice had formed over the curved steel of the pressure hull, stretching 20 feet across and climbing all the way to the overhead piping. But the ice wasn't the worst part. The steel itself was failing. Right in the center of the frozen mass, the steel was visibly bowing inward. It was a massive, concave dent, easily 4 feet wide, pressing into the engine room. The thick coats of acoustic paint were cracking and peeling away in long, brittle strips. The heavy bolts securing the hydraulic manifolds to the bulkhead were snapping off one by one under the immense stress, pinging across the compartment like shrapnel. Whatever was out there was resting its weight against us, and the sheer, impossible mass of it was crushing the submarine like an empty beer can. I roared to break out the shoring kit, get the 4x4 steel box beams and the mechanical jacks. We have to brace that dent against the main turbine casing. My boys moved. Fear is a paralyzing agent, but physical labor, the desperate need to do something with your hands, is the antidote. We dragged heavy steel beams from the damage control lockers. We hauled the massive, threaded mechanical jacks across the slick deck. We set the base of the first steel beam against the solid, immovable foundation of the main steam turbine. We angled the top of the beam directly into the center of the concave dent on the freezing bulkhead. I yelled to set the wedges, drive them in, lock it down. Miller grabbed a thick oak wedge and jammed it between the steel beam and the bulkhead. I swung the heavy sledgehammer in the cramped space, bringing the iron head down onto the wood. The sound of the hammer striking the wedge was deafening in the dead, silent submarine. It echoed through the entire boat. I pulled the hammer back and swung again. I swung a third time. I lowered the hammer, panting, my breath pluming in the freezing air. Ordered them to get the second beam set. Right next to, I stopped. From the other side of the frozen steel bulkhead, directly opposite where I had just struck the wedge, something answered me. 3 massive concussive strikes, mimicking the exact rhythm and spacing of my sledgehammer blows. The force of the impacts vibrated through the steel beam we had just set, shaking the heavy wood wedge loose. I stared at the bulkhead, the heavy sledgehammer slipping in my gloved hands. It was mocking us. It had felt the vibrations of our desperate repair efforts, and it was playing the game back to us. And then, the knocking escalated. It didn't just come from the dent in front of me. It came from everywhere. It sounded as if 50 men in heavy boots and diving suits had suddenly swarmed the outside of the boat, gripping heavy iron wrenches, sledgehammers, and steel pipes, and were frantically, violently beating on the pressure hull. The noise was absolute, deafening chaos. It was a frantic cacophony of metallic strikes coming from the forward torpedo room, the sail, the reactor compartment, and the engine room. It was the emergency tap code, but it was overlapping itself 100 times, creating a wall of acoustic terror that physically vibrated the air inside the submarine. It sounded exactly like a crew of 109 men, trapped in the freezing dark, desperately begging to be let in. Miller screamed over the deafening roar of the hammering, covering his ears with his heavy gloves. Asked what it was. Asked what's out there. I didn't have an answer. I dropped the sledgehammer and grabbed the sound-powered phone, cranking the handle until I felt the resistance of the circuit. I shouted that the shoring is failing. The vibration is shaking the jacks loose. We can't brace the hull. Elias told me to get back to control. Now. Abandon the shoring. Said we are losing Vance. I didn't hesitate. I ordered Miller and the damage control team to fall back, sealing the heavy watertight door of the engine room behind us, isolating the freezing compartment. We ran forward through the red-lit passageways. The frantic, overlapping knocking followed us, the sound surrounding us, pressing in on us from every side. It felt as though the submarine was being digested by a swarm of iron-jawed insects. When I burst through the door into the control room, the scene was one of absolute, unraveling madness. The depth gauge read 1,485 feet. We were sinking faster now. The bulkheads were groaning continuously, a high-pitched, agonizing squeal of metal that was being stretched beyond its atomic limits. But the true horror was in the sonar shack. Vance was no longer in his chair. The young acoustic savant was on his knees on the steel deck, thrashing violently. He had ripped his heavy sonar headphones apart, the wires dangling uselessly from the console. His hands were clamped over his ears, and blood, bright vivid red in the emergency lighting, was leaking through his fingers, running down the sides of his neck. He screamed for us to make it stop, said it's not in the water, it's in the steel. It's in his head. Elias and the diving officer were on the deck with him, trying to hold his arms down, trying to keep him from smashing his own skull against the metal bulkheads. Elias roared to get the corpsman. Get a sedative. I rushed forward and grabbed Vance's legs, throwing my weight over his lower body to pin him to the deck. The kid was possessing hysterical strength, his muscles rigid and bucking. I yelled at him to look at me. Look at me, son. The hydrophones are off. You aren't wearing the headset. Vance shrieked about the acoustic mirror. Said it's not bouncing sound off the trench anymore. It's using us. The submarine is the mirror. The hull is a tuning fork. It's resonating the frequency directly into the air. They want to come in, Chief. The Proteus wants to come in. Elias commanded us to hold him still. The corpsman arrived a moment later, stumbling into the control room with a medical kit. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the syringe twice before he managed to uncap it. He drove the needle into Vance's thigh, injecting a heavy dose of diazepam directly into the muscle. It took nearly a minute for the drug to take effect. Slowly, Vance's thrashing subsided. His eyes rolled back, and his body went limp against the steel deck, his breathing ragged and shallow. The blood from his ruptured eardrums pooled slightly on the non-skid surface. We dragged him out of the sonar shack and laid him against the forward bulkhead, out of the way. I stood up, my chest heaving, and looked at Elias. The captain was staring at the depth gauge, 1,495 feet. The knocking on the hull hadn't stopped. It was a continuous, deafening roar of metal striking metal. The submarine was shuddering violently under the acoustic assault. The pressure hull was screaming, the rivets popping, the valves weeping freezing seawater into the bilges. I said we are at 1,500 feet. The engine room bulkhead is caved in by 4 feet. The structural integrity is gone. In less than 3 minutes, the pressure hull is going to shear. We will implode. Elias stood in the center of the control room, bathed in the blood-red light, surrounded by the deafening hammering of the dead. He looked at the terrified faces of his crew. He looked at Julian, who who was curled into a ball near the navigation table, his arrogant intelligence officer facade completely shattered, muttering to himself with his eyes squeezed shut. Elias had exhausted every logical option. He couldn't blow ballast. He couldn't restart the reactor. He couldn't fight a threat he couldn't see. But Elias was a hunter-killer commander, and he refused to die quietly in the dark. He asked for the physics, then said if we are already dead, then doctrine no longer applies. If that thing outside is using acoustics to hunt us, to mimic us, to torture us, then we are going to blind it. I stared at him, realizing exactly what he was about to do. I said, if you go active down here, at this depth, bounded by the trench walls and the ice canopy, the acoustic shockwave will be catastrophic. It will bounce back and hit us with the force of a physical explosion. It could shatter the hull. Elias said the hull is already shattering. He turned to the diving officer, ordered him to route emergency battery power to the active sonar array, bypass the safety interlocks. The diving officer scrambled into the sonar operator's chair and began flipping the heavy toggle switches on the console. Going active with a submarine's primary sonar array is the naval equivalent of turning on a massive stadium floodlight in a pitch-black room while screaming at the top of your lungs. It emits an acoustic pulse so powerful that it can deafen marine life for miles. It is a weapon of last resort, used only to get a definitive targeting lock in the final seconds before firing a torpedo. The diving officer said power routed. Capacitors are charging, but the array is mounted in the bowsphere. Whatever is out there is wrapped around the entire boat. The reverberation will kill us. Elias said he doesn't care about the reverberation. Ordered pulse duration to maximum continuous. Do not give a ping. Give a hammer. Set the frequency to the lowest, most concussive band. Shatter the water around us. The diving officer said capacitors at maximum. His finger hovered over the red firing stud on the console. The frantic, deafening hammering on the outside of the hull seemed to reach a fever pitch, as if the entity outside could sense the buildup of electrical energy within the bow. The SOS codes overlapped into a singular metallic roar. The hull groaned, a deep, agonizing bend of steel that told me the implosion was seconds away. Elias said execute. The diving officer pressed the stud. The sound that erupted from the bow of the submarine defied description. It wasn't a ping. It was a deafening, physical screech of acoustic agony. It sounded like a massive sheet of metal being ripped apart by godlike hands, amplified 1,000 times over. The shockwave hit us instantly. The sound wave traveled out from the bowsphere, hit the walls of the trench, hit the ice canopy above, and slammed back into our own hull. The submarine bucked violently, throwing every man in the control room to the deck. The glass dials on the repeater gauges shattered, raining sharp fragments over us. The red emergency lights flickered and died for a terrifying second, before buzzing back to life. My ears popped painfully, a sharp spike of pressure driving into my skull, and a high-pitched ringing completely drowned out the ambient noise of the boat. I pushed myself up off the deck, shaking my head, my vision blurred. The active sonar pulse continued to scream, a continuous blinding wave of acoustic energy pouring into the black water. And then, I realized something. The knocking had stopped. The frantic, overlapping hammering on the outer hull was gone. The mimicking voices were gone. The active pulse had shocked the acoustic mirror, shattering the localized frequency that whatever was outside was using to torment us. I yelled at them to look at the screen. The diving officer pointed a shaking, bleeding finger at the primary waterfall display. The active sonar was painting a picture of the water immediately surrounding the submarine, using the returning sound waves to map the physical space. Elias and I pulled ourselves up to the console, staring at the green glowing monitor. It didn't show a Soviet stealth drone. It didn't show the wrecked hull of the USS Proteus. The screen was filled with a massive, sprawling silhouette. It was biologically impossible. It had no defined geometric shape, no hard angles of a manufactured machine. It looked like a colossal, undulating mass of thick, overlapping cables or limbs, wrapped entirely around the cylindrical hull of our submarine. The mass was so huge that it extended past the limits of our short-range active pulse, disappearing into the black water of the trench. It was an entity of the deep, something ancient and massive, drawn to the electromagnetic hum of our reactor, learning our sounds, mimicking our voices, and slowly trying to crack our steel shell open to get to the heat inside. We stared at the impossible image on the screen, the screech of the active sonar still vibrating in our teeth. The entity had stopped knocking. The active pulse had heard it, or confused it, breaking its grip on our acoustic signature. But it hadn't let go. The silence of the knocking was suddenly replaced by a new sound. It was slower, heavier. It was the horrific, agonizing screech of immense mass shifting against the acoustic tiles of our outer hull. It sounded exactly like the slow, deliberate scrape of heavy metal claws dragging across the steel, searching for a seam. It was no longer trying to trick us into opening the hatch. It was going to tear the submarine apart. The sound of the acoustic tiles being stripped from our outer hull was a sickening, continuous shriek that defied all logic. These were thick, heavy panels of synthetic rubber, chemically bonded to the steel pressure hull to absorb sonar waves. Whatever was wrapped around us wasn't just scraping them, it was peeling them off in massive strips, searching for a seam, searching for a weakness in the metal beneath. The vibration was so violent that the glass covers on the few remaining intact gauges in the control room vibrated loose and shattered on the deck. We were at 1,510 feet, 40 feet from our classified crush depth. The submarine was dead in the water, bleeding its residual heat into the freezing abyss, and we were being eaten alive by a nightmare. Elias stood near the navigation table, his hands gripping the brass railing so tightly his knuckles were bloodless. He had fired the active sonar, and it had broken the entity's acoustic mimicry. It had stopped the phantom voices and the tap code. But it had also enraged the thing. It was no longer trying to trick us into opening the hatch. It was using its sheer, impossible physical mass to tear us open. The diving officer whispered the depth was 1,515 feet. The hull is yielding, going to implode in less than 60 seconds. Elias didn't look at him. His eyes were locked on the green waterfall display of the active sonar, watching the massive, undulating silhouette that was wrapped around us. The creature was shifting, its mass moving upward toward the sail, constricting around the upper half of the submarine. He said it's trying to crush the access trunk. It knows that's the weakest point in the pressure hull. He asked me for our ascent rate if we blow every single drop of air we have into the main ballast tanks simultaneously. I did the math instantly in my head. It was a suicide equation. I told him we will rocket upward. We'll hit 20, maybe 25 knots of vertical speed. But the ice canopy. We are directly beneath the Arctic ice pack. If we hit 30 feet of solid ice at 25 knots, the impact will crush the sail, tear off the periscopes, and likely rupture the forward compartments. We will breach the hull. Elias replied that if we stay here for another 40 seconds, we are dead. If we hit the ice, we might die. He will take the might. But he needed me to manually open the primary air banks. The hydraulic lines to the remote actuators were severed when the portside bulkhead caved in. I have to go back to the engine room, manually bypass the safeties, and open the high-pressure manifolds. I looked at the watertight door leading aft. The engine room was a freezing, collapsing tomb. But Elias was right. It was our only, desperate play. Elias ordered the diving officer to keep the active sonar pinging continuously. Do not stop. Keep hitting it with the maximum acoustic shockwave. Disorient it. Hurt it. Make it loosen its grip just enough for the buoyancy to rip us out of its grasp. I didn't wait. I grabbed my battle lantern and sprinted for the aft watertight door. Miller was right behind me. We dogged the heavy steel door open and threw ourselves into the darkness of the reactor tunnel. The cold was absolute. The emergency red lighting had failed in the aft compartments, leaving us completely dependent on the narrow beams of our lanterns. Our breath froze instantly in the air, falling as a fine mist of ice crystals. The groaning of the steel was deafening here, a continuous, high-pitched scream of metal begging to be released from the pressure. We reached the engine room hatch. I grabbed the locking wheel, my heavy gloves slipping on the frost that coated the metal. Miller grabbed the wheel with me, and together we forced it open. We stepped into the engine room, and I immediately saw that we were out of time. The massive concave dent in the portside bulkhead had deepened. The heavy steel box beams we had used to shore it up had been snapped like dry twigs, the thick oak wedges pulverized into splinters. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. Right at the center of the dent, the steel had finally sheared. It was a microscopic fracture, no wider than a sewing needle, but at 1,500 feet, the water pressure on the outside was over 660 pounds per square inch. The seawater was shooting through that tiny crack with the force of an industrial water jet cutter. It was a razor-thin beam of freezing, highly pressurized water cutting straight across the engine room, slicing cleanly through a heavy bundle of electrical cables and sparking violently against the turbine casing. I screamed to stay low. If that water jet hits you, it will cut you in half. Crawl under the reduction gears. We have to reach the high-pressure air manifolds on the starboard side. We scrambled on our hands and knees across the freezing, slick deck, sliding through pools of half-frozen condensation. The deafening roar of the active sonar pulsing from the bow vibrated through the deck, mixing with the horrific, tearing scrape of the entity on the outside of the hull, and the high-pitched hiss of the pressurized water slicing through the room. It was sensory overload, a pure, distilled nightmare of noise, cold, and imminent death. We reached the starboard bulkhead. The emergency air manifolds were a cluster of massive, heavy brass valves, coated in a thick layer of white frost. The hydraulic lines that normally operated them from the control room hung uselessly, severed by the shifting hull. I yelled to grab the manual override wrench. Miller tore it from its brackets and fitted it over the first massive valve wheel. I grabbed the handle with him. The valve was frozen shut, the brass contracted by the sub-zero temperature radiating from the port side. I counted to 3. We threw every ounce of our strength into the wrench. My muscles screamed, my boots slipping on the ice. For a terrifying second, the valve refused to budge. The engine room groaned, a massive structural shift echoing through the space. The pinhole leak on the port side widened slightly, the hiss turning into a violent roar as the jet of water thickened. With a sharp metallic crack that sounded like a gunshot, the ice on the valve broke. The brass wheel turned. I yelled to open it wide. Bleed it all. We spun the wheel frantically. We moved to the second valve, then the third, throwing them wide open, manually dumping thousands of cubic feet of air, stored at 4,000 pounds per square inch, directly into the main ballast tanks. The sound of the high-pressure air expanding into the tanks was a deafening, continuous thunderclap. It shook the entire submarine, vibrating the fillings in my teeth. The air violently displaced the seawater in the ballast tanks, instantly changing the mass of the 14,000-ton vessel. For 3 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. The entity's immense weight, wrapped around our hull, held us down in the black trench. The submarine shuddered violently, caught in a tug-of-war between the unstoppable physics of buoyancy and the biological impossibility of the creature's grip. Then, the buoyancy won. The submarine lurched upward with a violence that threw Miller and me completely off our feet. We slammed hard against the steel grating of the deck. My lantern flew from my hand, shattering against a pipe and plunging us into total darkness. The ascent was not a smooth, controlled maneuver. It was a chaotic, terrifying rocket launch. The deck angled sharply upward, pinning us against the aft bulkhead. The continuous screeching pulse of the active sonar echoed through the steel, hammering the creature outside. I could hear the horrific tearing sound of the entity's grip slipping, its massive limbs or cables dragging across the hull, ripping away the last of the acoustic tiles, unable to hold on to the massive steel cylinder as it accelerated toward the surface. The pressure gauges in the engine room spun wildly. We were ascending at over 25 knots, a completely uncontrolled broach. I screamed into the darkness, grabbing a heavy steel stanchion and wrapping my arms and legs around it, burying my face in my jacket. Braced for impact, I counted the seconds in my head, calculating our speed against the 1,400 feet of water above us. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. The temperature in the engine room began to rise slightly as we shot out of the supercooled thermal layer of the trench. 30 seconds. We were going to hit the ice. The impact was the most violent physical trauma I have ever experienced. It felt as if the submarine had been dropped from an airplane onto solid concrete. The deafening crash of 14,000 tons of steel slamming into 30 feet of solid Arctic ice at 25 knots defied human comprehension. The sound was a catastrophic, bone-shattering boom that physically knocked the breath out of my lungs. The submarine didn't just hit the ice, it punched through it. The reinforced steel of the sail acted like a massive battering ram, fracturing the ice canopy, sending thousands of tons of frozen blocks tumbling across the top of our hull. The violent deceleration ripped my grip from the stanchion, throwing me through the air. I slammed hard into a cluster of insulated pipes, feeling a rib crack, before tumbling to the deck in a daze. Then, there was silence. The active sonar had died. The screeching, tearing sounds on the hull had stopped. The high-pitched hiss of the water leak had ceased, as the external pressure equalized with the interior. The submarine was rocking gently, side to side. We were floating. I lay in the darkness of the engine room for a long time, my chest heaving, the taste of copper and diesel oil thick in my mouth. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up. I found Miller a few feet away, groaning, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, but alive. We managed to manually dog open the watertight door and limped forward toward the control room. The scene in the forward compartments was one of utter devastation. The emergency lighting had completely failed upon impact. The crew was using battle lanterns to illuminate the wreckage. Consoles had been ripped from their mounts. The periscope housing had been violently shoved downward by the impact with the ice, shattering the navigation table. Dozens of men were bleeding, nursing broken bones and severe concussions. But we were alive. Elias was standing beneath the access trunk in the center of the control room. He was bleeding from a deep gash above his eye, his uniform torn and covered in hydraulic fluid. He was looking up at the heavy steel hatch. I rasped that the engine room is secure. We have minor flooding from a structural shear, but the pressure equalization stopped it. The reactor is scrammed, but the containment is intact. Elias looked at me, his eyes hollow. The fire of command completely burned out of him. He nodded slowly. He told me to open the hatch. I climbed the steel ladder up into the access trunk. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the heavy locking wheel. I engaged the equalization valve, listening to the hiss of the pressurized air venting out of the submarine. Then, I turned the wheel, throwing the heavy steel latches, and pushed the hatch open. A blast of freezing, pure Arctic air poured down into the submarine. It was the sweetest, most intoxicating thing I have ever breathed. It didn't smell like amine, or diesel, or fear. It smelled like the world. I pulled myself up through the trunk and emerged onto the top of the sail. It was night. The sky was an endless, breathtaking canopy of brilliant stars, undisturbed by human light. We had completely shattered the ice shelf. Massive, jagged blocks of ice, some the size of houses, were piled up around the hull of the submarine. The black water of the Barents Sea lapped gently against the scarred steel. I shone my flashlight down the length of the boat. The damage was catastrophic. The entire port side of the submarine was stripped bare, the thick acoustic tiles completely torn away, leaving the naked gray steel exposed to the freezing air. And carved into that naked steel were the grooves. They ran parallel to each other, dozens of them, stretching for 50 feet along the hull. They were 3 inches deep, cutting directly into the high-yield steel, as if a massive, multi-pronged garden hoe had been dragged across wet clay. No seamount, no collision with the ice, could have created those marks. They were the desperate claw marks of something immense, something biological, trying to hold on to its prey as it was dragged toward the surface. Whatever it was, it belonged to the crushing pressure of the abyss. The rapid ascent, the loss of pressure, or perhaps simply the exposure to the surface, had forced it to let go. It had fallen back down into the dark. We sat dead in the water for 3 days. With no propulsion and no ability to transmit a long-range radio signal, we were entirely reliant on the emergency locator beacon. On the morning of the 4th day, a United States Navy icebreaker, escorted by 2 destroyers, broke through the pack and found us. The cover-up began the moment we were towed into a highly classified dry dock facility in Norfolk, Virginia. Naval intelligence descended on the crew like a swarm of locusts. Julian, who had spent the entire time on the surface locked in his stateroom with his titanium briefcase, vanished the moment we hit the pier. We never saw him again. The crew was quarantined in a secure facility for 2 months. We were subjected to endless debriefings, psychological evaluations, and polygraph tests. We were told, repeatedly and forcefully, that we had suffered a severe navigational error, collided with an uncharted seamount, and experienced mass auditory hallucinations due to an accidental release of toxic amine gas from the air scrubbers. Elias refused to sign the official report. He stood in front of an admiralty board and told them exactly what happened. He told them about the acoustic mimicry, the impossible mass, the grooves in the steel. They quietly stripped him of his command, revoked his security clearance, and forced him into early medical retirement, citing severe combat fatigue and psychological trauma. The Navy broke a brilliant commander because he refused to lie about the dark. Vance never recovered. The diazepam had stopped his thrashing, but it couldn't erase what the acoustic mirror had forced into his mind. He was diagnosed with severe acoustic trauma and schizophrenia. The last I heard, he was living in a VA psychiatric ward in Maryland, completely deaf by his own hand, refusing to sleep in any room that didn't have a solid wooden door he could lock from the inside. He still dreams about the tap code. I signed the non-disclosure agreements. I was a pragmatic man, an engineer. I knew that fighting the intelligence apparatus was a battle I couldn't win. I took a shore duty assignment, finished my 20 years, and retired quietly. But I never forgot the rules of what happened down there. The ocean is an alien world. We have mapped a fraction of a percent of the deep trenches. We send our nuclear submarines down into the lightless abyss, wrapped in steel, humming with electromagnetic energy, making noise in a place that has been silent for millions of years. Whatever attacked us wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a Soviet weapon. It was an apex predator of the deep sea, an entity so ancient and massive that it defies our biological understanding. In a world of absolute darkness, it adapted to hunt by sound. It learned to mimic the acoustic signatures of its prey. It had found the USS Proteus 3 years earlier. It had crushed that boat, learned the sound of its reactor, and absorbed the desperate tap code of its dying crew. And Julian, in his cold, calculating arrogance, had used those tapes to confirm his theory. He had dangled us over the trench, like a worm on a hook, just to see what would bite. A few years ago, the Freedom of Information Act forced the declassification of some obscure naval budget lines from the late 1980s. I spent weeks digging through the archives until I found what I was looking for. It was a funding request for a highly classified project called Deep Listener. It authorized the permanent deployment of automated, deep-sea hydrophone arrays, anchored to the seafloor in the exact coordinates of that Barents Sea trench. The United States Navy didn't kill the thing in the dark. They just set up microphones to listen to it. Decades later, those hydrophones are still active. They are still recording the black water. And I know, with absolute terrifying certainty, that if you put on a headset and listen to those classified tapes, you won't just hear the shifting of tectonic plates or the clicks of beluga whales. You will hear a heavy, metallic knocking. 3 fast, 3 slow, 2 heavy strikes. A dead crew, trapped in the freezing dark, patiently waiting for someone to open the hatch. Out there, in the lightless depths of the world, the Cold War might be over, but something is still listening, and it has learned exactly how we sound.